Production was a central orientation in Robin's practice, and Formacion is a significant variant of this. He was involved in Formacion throughout his life, but it's not a practice he addressed much on the page. This chapter makes an attempt at that. In Formacion, I see the main thing being produced as scope. Robin did write about that as the problem of scale, and will bring the discussion into a focus on that theme. I'm addressing Formacion in the following way, as practices of skillful production of formations of radical activist practice, which have the capability to produce working chunks of forces of production, which prefigure, construct and maintain the living economy. Making the landscape of material means of subsistence and well-being, the living economy, can be seen as the curriculum of Formacion. You might say the new economics. Here I'm concerned with the hidden curriculum, how the making is made. That is, I'm concerned with the forces of production of Formacion, as distinct from the forces of production of the living economy. We could say this was second order, or we could say it was primary. The terms radical and prefiguring appear above. I address these by talking about relations of production. Forces and relations of production are the basic terms of analysis here, and altered relations of production are at the heart of this view of Formacion and of making the living economy. I'll develop this discussion in three areas. Formacion as activist literacy in cultural production, the weaving of formations of practice, or the dance of knowing, and the problem of scale, the production of scope. Both Formacion and making the living economy must skillfully interweave practical things in what I'll describe as three landscapes: the material landscape, the cultural landscape, and the aesthetic landscape. The three landscapes, material, cultural, aesthetic, necessarily interweave, but they call for quite distinct kinds of recognition and handling, that is, distinct skills, genres, stories, frames of conceptualization. This diversity is one reason why Formacion is difficult work. It needs to be fluent in what Cook and Brown call the generative dance of knowing. I'll outline this in a moment, and the majority of this chapter is taken up with an expansion of that concept of Formacion as a dance of a multi-skilled kind. Formacion is centrally a practice of cultural production. Practices of material production, the workings of the living economy, are largely another story, another chapter. That's the formal content of the curriculum of Formacion. Here we're concerned with the practical form of the curriculum. In conceptualising practices of cultural production, I'll use a mapping of practice which was proposed by Noam Cook and John Seeley Brown at Xerox PARC in the 90s. They call it the generative dance of knowing. They argued that there are four components of knowing and capability, constituted by individual and group practice on one hand, and by explicit talking about and tacit doing on the other. This schema warrants some fine-tuning, but for now we'll just work with it as is. Their main emphasis was on the generative dance that skillfully and continuously weaves a choreography through all the four quadrants. Robin was especially active on the right side of this 2x2 schema, storytelling and the practical development on the ground of genres of cooperating. Rather loosely, he called this latter networking. We'll come back to this when we talk about scale. He wrote little, either as storytelling or conceptualization, that described these skillful kinds of work. Probably the most explicit attention was in the two handbooks from the Young Foundation around 10 years ago, the Open Book of Social Innovation and Social Venturing. Robin gave less energy to working over on the left side of the schema, relatively formal conceptual schemes and tools or skills with tools and materials. The present chapter is rather conceptual and in parts even schematic, and places the emphasis more that way. Here we expand Cook and Brown's basic schema to consider 4 kinds of literacy in the dance of Formacion. In each dimension there are relations of production and altered relations of production. It's the relations of production that determine what the scope of the practice might be. I see activist literacy in Formacion lying in 4 different kinds of weaving and dancing which need to be combined. First, weaving 4 modes of rigour in the production of knowledges and capability. In each quadrant of the dance of knowing, there are different modes of rigour. In the field of producing knowledges, these amount to relations of production. Literacy involves knowing how to mobilise these, constructing altered labour powers. This is basically what Cook and Brown were pointing to in their original perspective on the dance. Second, class practices in the organising of knowing. Various forms of class practice in the producing and mobilising of knowledges have evolved during Fordism and post-Fordism. Altered relations of production in this dimension of knowing constitute different cultural formations, activist formations, radical formations, prefigurative formations, with different scopes and different politics. 4 relations of production are highlighted. Third, competing structures of feeling. In each of the 4 quadrants of the dance of knowing, there are choices between structures of feeling, distinct variations in aesthetics around any broad orientation to rigour. These may be more or less liberatory. The hidden curriculum of Formacion is very much concerned with these, that is, with liberation, the production of changed heart, as well as production. Their relations to production in the aesthetic landscape. And fourth, 4 extents of reach in activist practice. Practice can have a finer or coarser grained focus. I propose a framing in terms of 4 zones of proximity and reach. Each can be a zone of critical transformation. For great scope, a practice needs to be skillfully present across all extents of reach. We'll consider 5 modes of producing scope. These contributions to scope are related to the dimensions of the dance of knowing, which we already considered. In other words, what the activist dance of knowing in Formacion does, through weaving cultural formations under altered relations of production, is produce scope. Robin persistently addressed the challenge of scale. Here we outline how Formacion is a way, perhaps the way, to deal with scale. Robin sought to escape scale, which he saw as a Fordist notion. In various contexts, he used various biological metaphors: DNA, trees, branching, seeds, cells, strawberry plants. In this section, we'll outline an approach in practical terms of human scope, rather than metaphors of vegetable processes. Rather than focusing on the quantitative extent of scale, we'll focus on the qualitative business of scaling, the practical production of practices at scale. First, networking. In a 2009 Fair Trade presentation, Robin argued that what he called networking was much more important than the mechanics of doing the business. what he went on to illustrate with photos from his own engagement in Twin was classic labour of cultural production, enabling people across many locations in the supply chain to share stories and concepts and share modes of doing. This was referred to earlier in discussing modes of rigour in the Dance of Knowing. Perhaps this is the social substance of his favoured metaphor of strawberry plants. Second, facilitation. Earlier, discussing class forms of knowledge production, I highlighted the emergent 70s politics of facilitation. Robin was familiar with this, for example, from Queen's Park Books, and from the rank-and-file shop stewards movement that gave rise to the Lucas Stewards Alternative Plan. And this was the rationale behind funding the grant-funded economy at the GLC. This literacy is at work in his Strawberry Plants networking in fair trade. Third, structure of feeling. I spoke earlier of competing structures of feeling as carrying altered relations of aesthetic production. Robin had an eye for alternative structures of feeling in the Dance of Knowing, in conceptualising, storytelling, skills, genres. This propagating of structures of feeling looks to me like the essence of what he spoke of in terms of DNA, or the propagating of seeds and cells. Fourth, the reach of an activist life. From the travelogue of his 2009 Fair Trade Conference presentation, or his 2016 life story in a Schumacher podcast, Robin can be seen weaving with the thread of his own life, moving and engaging across places, across continents. This bespeaks a well-practiced sense of expansive movement across the zones of reach that I referred to earlier. And fifth, techniques of digital media. Over on the left side of Cook and Brown's schema, Robin was less involved in the techniques of material infrastructure in weaving networks of Formacion. In the full chapter, I'll consider here some kinds of media containers as material infrastructure for activist literacy. In various ways, these go beyond the post-Fordist platform techniques of the age of Google. Finally, Robin's perception and mine. There clearly is a difference in our tendency towards narrative and conceptualising tools and genres, explicit and tacit modes. This here is a highly conceptualised account. Nevertheless, it arises out of a story of an activist life, an analysis of actual practice in all landscapes, in actual places. It just happens to involve a different temperament and a different skill set. The world of the future, the living economy, needs to be a pluriverse, and all literacies need to be mobilised. All modes of rigour, all kinds of scope, all fields of practice. Formacion needs to support them all in a skillful dance of knowing.